All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our All About Invasive series program. My name is Emily Kring, and I am a Purdue Extension Agriculture and Natural Resources educator in the East Central Indiana region. Um, Welcome. This is a collaborative webinar series hosted by SICM and Purdue Extension. And today, Katie O'Reilly is joining us from Illinois Indiana Sea Grant to talk about protecting your pond from invasives. So this series is designed to provide practical, research-based information and equip us with simple actions we can all take to protect our native ecosystems and prevent the spread of invasive species. So if you have any questions while Katie is teaching today, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll address them at the end of her presentation. So with that, I'll let Katie go ahead and introduce herself.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Emily. And thank you, everyone, for joining this afternoon, spending your lunch learning about invasive species. As Emily said, my name is Katie O'Reilly. I am the Aquatic Invasive Species Specialist with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, which is an organization based out of Purdue, but also housed at the University of Illinois, which is where I sit in the Illinois Natural History Survey. And I'm really excited today to talk about the wetter side of invasive species, aquatic invasive species. And so, you're all here, love your environments, want to take care of them. And we know that healthy aquatic ecosystems, whether it's a stream, a lake, a pond, provide us with a lot of benefits. Everything from, irrigation for fields, support of recreation like fishing, or just, the general enjoyment of observing a water body. The benefits are numerous. But at the same time, so are the challenges facing water bodies across Indiana, across the Midwest. And, these are sort of the usual suspects, things like pollution, whether that's, visible plastic pollution or any way, down to things that we can't observe visually, like heavy metals. Water bodies such as ponds also face another challenge that we all experience, which is loss of habitat, whether that is development for, agriculture, development for new housing, uh, or just, the loss of habitat for other reasons. But another one of the challenges that we'll focus on today is that water bodies also face threats from invasive species just as terrestrial ecosystems do. And I like to think, about a pond or a lake as a jigsaw puzzle. And in a healthy pond, all of the pieces that are, range from the living kind of elements or what we call biotic to the abiotic elements, the geography or geology, they all come together in in sync to give us those benefits that we really enjoy, whether it's fishing, irrigation. But when you have a threat like an invasive species that changes or, affects different parts of that puzzle, you start to lose the picture over time. You may, lose things here and there that lead to a cascade where eventually some of the things that you value in a pond are lost because you've lost these different pieces of the puzzle. And so with that, what we'll talk about today are really kind of three goals I'd like you to come away with. And that is, understanding a little bit more about how aquatic invasive species can harm your pond, stream, or lake. Learning about and how to identify some of the aquatic invasive species of concern in Indiana. And then really kind of gaining the tools and knowledge that can help you protect your pond from aquatic invasive species. And we'll talk about, different ways that you can manage and control so that you keep that puzzle intact, going back to that metaphor. And to address the elephant in the room, I guess, or the carp more appropriately, Probably when you hear aquatic invasive species, one of the first things that may come to mind, being that we live in the Midwest, is that, the invasive carp, the ones you see jumping out of the water, notoriously known for smacking people, sometimes funnily, sometimes with bodily injury. But when we talk about aquatic invasive species, it is definitely more than just the carp. The carp obviously are a big concern we have. However, the silver carp, these jumping guys, are not typically found in ponds. They're more big river systems. So you have them in the Wabash and the, Mississippi River. So they are definitely, an invasive species we're concerned about, but I'm not going to get into them as much today, which as a fish person does hurt my heart. But let's kick off just with some terminology, which I know you're kind of like, this is sort of dry, but I think it's important because when we talk about invasive species, whether it's terrestrial or aquatic, there's often a lot of words that get thrown around somewhat interchangeably. But in terms of how we as biologists think about it, there are differences. So, essentially, when we're talking about something that's native, it's a species that we consider to occur naturally in a specified geographic area, generally, pre-European settlement here in North America. The term non-native generally is used when a species does not naturally occur in a specified geographic area. That is different somewhat to the term introduced, which is used to describe a species that's brought to a new place, either intentionally or unintentionally through human actions. And we'll talk about what some of those actions are coming up. The term established, when talking about invasive species or non-native species introduced, is a specific term that is used when a population or a species is self-sustaining, so it's able to reproduce without humans, intervening in some way, like humans stocking fish into a pond. They are actually able to reproduce. But what we're going to be talking about today are species that are considered invasive. And so invasive is an established non-native species that has been introduced by human activity with the caveat that it causes harm to some aspect, whether that's to the economy, to the environment, or to human well-being. And so my kind of shorthand for like when I'm saying invasive, it's a species, like I said, non-native, so not originally from the geographic area that we're focusing on here in Indiana. It is established, so there's a reproducing population, and it's causing some kind of harm, however that may be. So with that in mind, we could have a whole series of webinars just on the impacts of aquatic invasive species because they are wide-ranging. But in general, it's things like predation on native species, the introduction and spread of different diseases. They oftentimes change food webs or how energy flows through an ecosystem. They often result in a loss of general biodiversity because they tend to sort of take over an ecosystem when they become established and it's just all, the invasive species. They also oftentimes alter a habitat, so they somewhat are ecosystem engineers in that they can change the habitat to make it, maybe more suitable for them, less suitable for native species. And then oftentimes they result in impacts to transportation and recreation. So, shipping for as well as just taking your boat out on the pond. And all of those impacts, just, even generally speaking, really add up to big costs. In fact, there was a study that came out a couple of years ago that estimated invasive species cost the US, upwards of $1 trillion over the past 60 years, just, in both the impacts that they have as well as the actions that people take to control them. So, even if it's one pond or one lake, they add up when you're thinking about a big geographic region. And earlier, when we were talking about humans introducing um, invasive species don't necessarily get to a new place just by themselves. They are facilitated or helped by human activities. And that can be either intentional, sometimes in the case of wanting to bring a species over for like a water garden, an ornamental species, or to create a new food source. Or it can be sort of unintentional, like, you bring over or you're using a species as bait, but it gets accidentally released because of, you know, dumping your bait at the end of a fishing day, where that's not necessarily like intentionally trying to bring it to an ecosystem. There's also a lot of ways that invasive species, can inadvertently spread once they get to a new place. So, for example, maybe something was brought over as an ornamental plant, but then its seeds or fragments can stick to a boat coming out of a lake. So they hitchhike to new ecosystems from that, first initial bringing over event. Even things that are somewhat out of human control can help spread invasive species when they get to new places. Things like floods or storm events that, maybe you think, oh, these are this species of fish that we've introduced for aquaculture is just in its own little self-contained pond. However, a flooding event may make that pond connected to a larger water body, which was actually the case with those invasive silver carp jumpers that we talked about earlier. They originally were meant for fish ponds in the southeast, but then due to floods made their way to the Mississippi, which is like a super highway for all things aquatic. And kind of in general, there's so many different invasive species that we could talk about again. Could be years of a course. But in general, invasive species typically share characteristics that make them successful at, establishing a population, being able to self reproduce. And some of those characteristics are that they grow really quickly. So that once they get to a place, they're able to crowd out other species. They can reproduce also very quickly and oftentimes may reproduce multiple times in a season or a year. They also generally are really tolerant compared to native species, so they may live in habitats that have low oxygen. Maybe it's like really hot, warm, like temperature warm water that they can live in, um, which kind of also is why you find them a lot of times in disturbed areas. Where conditions may be really rough for native species. It's really, there's not a lot of plant life or it's very warm. And then oftentimes, because they're coming from a different location geographically, they lack native predators, competitors, or diseases that would act as sort of a check on them. And so for the remainder of the talk, I'm kind of use this graphic, which I'll walk us through as sort of a lens for looking at aquatic invasive species specifically. And to backtrack here, every invasion is slightly different. So, no two invasive species get to a new place, cause impacts, have management in the same way. But in general, they share characteristics, just like we talked about, kind of those biological characteristics that make them successful. And so this graphic I have up here is what we call the invasive species curve. And I'm going to walk through it step by step. So that's why you don't see a curve yet. Um, but essentially we're going from left to right would be the beginning, like time zero, your healthy pond, all the way to when an invasive species has really taken over. And from bottom to top, it's kind of like that's the area affected. So, a little area is affected near the bottom, all the way to, acres and acres of land affected. And the reason we think about this kind of graphically is because there are different steps we can take to control and protect ecosystems depending on where we're at in that sort of timeline or curve. So if we think about, healthy pond that doesn't have, an aquatic invasive species of concern, so this would be early on. The best thing that can happen here is that we prevent any introduction. This is when invasive species are totally absent from the environment. And so life is good, essentially. However, the kind of, say you get, or say, somebody dumps a fish tank into a pond, and there's a small number of potentially invasive species. They maybe haven't become established yet, so they haven't started reproducing. There may just be a very small number. This is oftentimes where you might be able to completely eradicate a species, but the flip side of that is because oftentimes early in the invasion, there's such a small number of individuals, it's really difficult to detect that. Like you may not even know they're present at that point. And so it's kind of this paradox of the easiest time to address an invasion is early on, but it's also the trickiest to observe and know. And going kind of along this time, as we continue to get time, more species, or not more species, but more individuals of a species are increasing. They're perhaps at this point becoming established, they're reproducing. You're really moving from kind of being able to eradicate a species and eradicate being completely getting rid of them to more of like trying to limit their spread. Um, this is often the kind of part of the curve where people start noticing like, oh, I'm seeing like, this weird plant in my pond. Um, so that's where, again, that paradox comes in. It's like when you start getting aware of it being a problem, that's also when you're shifting into it's harder to control them and you're more trying to limit the spread and mitigate the impacts on that ecosystem. And then the kind of final stage of the curve is when a species has become pretty widespread and abundant. And at this point, we're really dealing with more of just a control. So even more so than that previous stage where it's containing, trying to limit the spread, it's just trying to, at this point, adapt in some cases to the impacts, but also if there is management being done, and we'll talk about some specific management things, it often becomes a lot more expensive because you have to do it consistently. It may not get to the point where you ever can eradicate something because they are so widespread and abundant. So you're really thinking about longer term management. And so I said this would kind of be our focus tool for some specific invasive species, but I just wanted to, emphasize that even if you are all the way at the right end of the curve where something is really widespread and abundant, there are options. It's not, completely throw up our hands and just do whatever. But it is also a lot easier, a lot less expensive if you can target those early stages. So putting efforts into prevention, early detection so that you can, potentially eradicate a population early on when there's only a few individuals compared to when you're trying to sort of minimize the damage later in the invasion timeline. So, with the invasive invasion curve sort of in our minds, let's talk about some specific species of concern in Indiana and how we can identify them, what some of their impacts are, and then what treatments are available or what kinds of management approaches are available to help control them. And so I have to start, as someone who has studied the Great Lakes, I have to start with zebra and quagga mussels. If you have been to the beach, up by the dunes or Michigan City, you have seen the shells of zebra and quagga mussels on the beaches. They are omnipresent. And so they give us a really good tool um, to actually look at two stages of the invasion curve. The Great Lakes are very much in that late, they are everywhere, they've been present. And so we're really thinking about long-term management. However, a lot of our inland lakes and ponds in Indiana may not have zebra and quagga mussels yet. And so in those cases, we really want to focus on prevention and early detection so that we don't run into a case where you are like the Great Lakes and have these mussel populations. So let's talk about the zebra and quagga mussels. What the heck are these guys? So I often refer to them both in the same breath. Obviously, they are two different species, but they are very closely related. They are both from kind of the Eastern Europe, Western Asia region, so the Black Sea. And they're generally small little mussels, maybe the size of your fingernail. They have very similar biology, very similar life histories. The biggest difference is actually that it's kind of weird. So, yes, the coloration's a little different. You get more of the zigzaggy patterns on the zebra mussels compared to these more, rings on the quagga mussels. But really, the tool I use a lot is if you put it on its side, the zebra mussel will lay flat. It kind of has a flat, I guess, bottom, you would say, when it's on its side versus the quagga mussel is more rounded, and so it'll just sort of tip over. Um, the quagga mussel is actually way more abundant in Lake Michigan these days than the zebra mussel is, which is a little quirk because they basically are more better at, or they're more efficient at feeding than the zebra mussels are. So if you are up in like Lake Michigan area, chances are more likely you're going to see quagga mussels. But if we're talking about inland lakes in Indiana, those are generally more zebra mussel. Like it's like more likely that you're running into a zebra mussel. And so I mentioned that they, are originally native to Eastern Europe, Western Asia, and they made their way to North America via ships that, trans or transport goods between Europe and the Great Lakes region. And those big cargo ships like the Lakers and this, well, this in this case it would be Salties because they are going across the ocean. Because of how they work, they have to take in ballast water to maintain buoyancy um, when they, to adjust for the level of cargo they have. And so in Eastern Europe, Western Asia, they loaded up ballast water at the source point that potentially contained the small floating larvae of zebra and quagga mussels, traversed the ocean, came to the Great Lakes, and then as cargo, or as cargo's exchanged to maintain buoyancy, discharging the ballast water at those destinations, um, and then releasing those larvae. And so we really did see the zebra and quagga mussels both show up in heavy shipping ports, which is why that is how we kind of deduced that they made their way here through shipping. First sightings were around like Detroit, St. Clair River area, but then they quickly spread throughout the rest of the Great Lakes because then, ships that just move in the Great Lakes were able to take in ballast water that contained their larvae, move them somewhere else like Duluth, Chicago, Burns Harbor, etc. Now you're probably thinking, okay, well, we don't have cargo ships on like our inland lakes. However, people who might take their boat out to Lake Michigan for a day on the water could potentially move some of those larvae that stick to the boat. They're very microscopic. So, you could have some stuck in some aquatic veg that's on your boat, mud even, in the bilge water, and then, taking boats and other gear to your local lake may transfer them as well. So we've seen sort of a secondary spread from the cargo ships that originally brought them to North America, and then recreational boating has helped them spread inland. And both zebra and quagga mussels together have had a lot of major impacts on the Great Lakes region, not just the Great Lakes themselves. So they tend to stick to everything, particularly any hard substrate, which can include things like water intake pipes, for drinking water, for power plant generation. So that really causes a lot of economic impacts. They also are the reason, that and this is kind of a weird impact, so stick with me. If you've been to Lake Michigan recently, in the last 10, 15 years, you probably have noticed it looks very tropical. And what I mean by tropical, it's like very clear water, very bright blue. And at first, you're probably like, oh, this is awesome. Like low pollution, the water's great. But the reason it is that clear and that blue is because of the way that these guys feed. So they're filter feeders. They're taking plankton and other particles out of the water column. Um, and you'd also think, okay, that's good because we don't want like a ton of like algae or anything, but they're taking the plankton that our native species need to survive. And so a lot of the impacts to fishing in the Great Lakes, have been linked to the fact that the native fish that we like, things like perch, whitefish, are not getting the plankton that they need to survive, which is essential when they're juveniles, especially. So it's almost like it shouldn't be that clear water, because we do want that base of the food web, which is plankton, that the zebra and quagga mussels have really monopolized. And then another impact is actually we've seen, some outbreaks of a disease called avian botulism, which has resulted in some seabird die-offs, in places like the west coast of Michigan, like Sleeping Bear Dunes area. And this is because the zebra and quagga mussels actually change the like chemistry of the bottom of the lakes, and they allow for the, bacteria that leads to avian botulism to flourish, by some of their chemical, changings, and that bacterium then can be, spread into birds via, their fish consumption. So it's like kind of one of those indirect impacts that you're like, oh, I it makes sense, but it's like it's not. It's like how do mussels cause die-offs of seabirds? And so what can we do about the zebra and quagga mussels? There are treatments. There's molluscicides, which is quite the word, as well as some other chemical applications. I know this Zequinox, which is a brand name, is actually like I want to say a virus that they were able to identify that is more like host specific to just the zebra mussels. Because the problem with a general molluscicide is that it's going to kill native mussels that we want, that are really important for aquatic ecosystems. So if you can have something that's a little bit more targeted, that would be ideal. There's also non-chemical treatments such as, the application of carbon dioxide, as well as physical things like drawing down water. But you'll see there are a couple asterisks there, and that is because any of these treatment options really only work effectively when you have a localized, relatively small invasion. So thinking back to our invasion curve early on in the process. When we're talking about water bodies that are bigger, I mean, the Great Lakes are the primary example. Full eradication is not feasible, even with these treatments, unfortunately. And so what can we do? There are two places, if we're thinking about sort of inland ponds in Indiana, that I think we could address things. And that's, preventing them from getting to new places. And so maybe having things like boat clean, encouraging people to clean their boats, um, so that they're not moving them between water bodies. And then if we can detect them early, like in a pond, or a reservoir, that's when, treatment is more likely to be effective when it's kind of early on in the process. So let's shift gears to a plant. This is probably a plant that you have seen, even if you didn't know necessarily its name. So it's the invasive Phragmites, or common reed. This is a species that is very much also in that kind of late stage of the invasion. It's been present in North America over 100 years, to the point that while we do have a native Phragmites species in North America, you would be hard pressed to find it these days because most everything is invasive Phragmites. And so let's talk about what this actually is. So when I said, you've probably seen this, this is a species that oftentimes is in roadside ditches. It grows super tall. It actually, I mean, it looks kind of pretty, until you actually have to walk through it as a wetland biologist. Phragmites is like the worst plant to work with because it just cuts up your arms and everything. Um, but the problem here is that as you can see from the picture on the left, it really does take over and form these dense sort of monocultures along the sides of ponds and lakes that does not allow a lot of great habitat for wildlife. There's some species like red-winged blackbirds that tend to like it, but most everything else is like, I'm out. And I mentioned that there is a native species of Phragmites. There are a few different characteristics, such as being able to, look at the leaf collar where the leaf attaches to the stem. There's some difference in coloration there. There's different color, like the native species typically has more purplish stems compared to the invasive, which is green. However, again, it's just really rare to find the native Phragmites species. So probably 90 to 95% of the time, you're going to be seeing the invasive Phragmites. And it's something that's been present in Indiana for a long time. And, a lot of people do manage Phragmites, and it can be managed, even though it is something that we're probably never going to get rid of because it's just so widespread and abundant. Um, there's your kind of typical application of herbicides. There's cutting and mowing. Oftentimes prescribed burns are used with Phragmites. You see just how much biomass and vegetation is there. But then Phragmites also, despite being a wetland plant, doesn't like too much water. So, you can, in some cases, flood it out. However, there's all these treatments, but oftentimes the most successful management of Phragmites typically is what we call integrated management, where you combine a few of those different treatments together. So I know one that has been used a lot around the Great Lakes region is people, or agencies apply herbicide first and then cut or burn afterwards to have sort of the best long-term results. And Phragmites, again, is something that really thrives well in disturbed areas. So that's kind of the challenge, is that even if you go through this management, you remove it, unless you do something like planting native vegetation right away, or, trying to make sure you're getting all of it out. The fact that you're disturbing the land in order to remove it paradoxically makes it a really good habitat for Phragmites to spring back up. So that's one of the things that makes its management really challenging. So those are two kind of established long-term species. I want to talk about three species that are a little bit either, and there's some difference. They're not all the same, but some that are newer, that we may not have in the state, but we're on the lookout for. Some that have been in the state a while, but maybe haven't spread as much. And then, trying to understand, again, different places in the invasion curve and different actions that we can take, with some of these other species that can threaten your pond. And so shifting gears back to my invertebrate friends, I I really like the red swamp crayfish. Don't get me wrong. I think it's a really cool organism. However, it is a pain in the butt as an invasive species. Luckily for Indiana, we're kind of in a goodish place right now. We have not seen a lot of sightings of the red swamp crayfish yet. However, we're kind of in between places because southern Michigan has been battling the red swamp crayfish pretty significantly, and then the Chicagoland area has also been battling them. So I feel like it's one of those species that even though we're not currently seeing it in Indiana, we need to be on the lookout for. And so that puts us more in the prevent as well as, if we can catch it early, what do we do in terms of trying to eradicate them? But let's meet the red swamp crayfish first and talk about it. So you might have wondered, okay, so Katie, why is it like in southern Michigan and around Chicago? One of the main, or the reason people like red swamp crayfish is because it is the crayfish that you get, if you order crayfish on a menu. It is the one that people do for crawfish boils. Uh, Crayfish, which also is called crawfish, crawdads, mud bugs, depending on where you're from or where you're at. Um, they are used not just for food, even though that is, I think how a lot of people know them, but they're also used oftentimes in the aquarium trade as pets. They're used in schools by teachers as sometimes classroom pets, but also sometimes for learning about anatomy. They're used in some cases as bait. So they have a lot of like human uses, which is part of the reason that we tend, at least in the Great Lakes, we've seen them pop up in city areas. So again, Chicago, Detroit, um, and the one challenge with them is that crayfish all look really similar. We actually have several species of native crayfish in Indiana, and you know, even for a biologist, crayfish can be tough to identify. And so that makes it challenging to know, okay, what do I have in my pond? And, is this something I should be concerned about? So the red swamp crayfish, compared to what we have natively in the state, oftentimes is a lot larger in size. So typically adults will be anywhere from 2 to 7 inches. Um, they often, I mean, coloration isn't like 100% guarantee, but perhaps not surprisingly, given their name, they're often a bright red color compared to the more muted colors that a lot of our native species have. But the biggest thing is actually looking at their backs. So if you're looking down on a crawfish like here or crayfish, with the red swamp crayfish, they'll have these two lines that's kind of an hourglass shape that touch or meet in the middle. Whereas many of our native species, and one that looks very similar is the white river crayfish, those lines will not touch. So there'll actually be a little gap between them. Um, I know that that is can be somewhat challenging, especially if you're holding a crayfish, considering they are very oftentimes not happy to be held. So, this might be a case where if you can snap a picture, send it to, your local extension specialist, they might be able to help with some of that identification because that can be kind of challenging. And why do we care about the invasive red swamp crayfish? You know, the one thing is, as I mentioned, they're a lot bigger in size than our native species, and they're a lot more aggressive. They're just kind of bullies. And so they oftentimes will outcompete native crayfish species, even native fish species, and sort of change the dynamics of the food web. However, another major thing with the red swamp crayfish is that they form burrows on this, either side of streams or the shallow areas of a pond or lake. And these burrows can be really extensive in size and lead to erosion and sort of, uh, you know, falling stream banks, things that we don't want like physically to happen. So they can engineer their environment in ways that can cause a lot of damage, structurally as well as to the environment. So shifting back to the plants, uh, I want to take a look at a species that, we talked about red swamp as something that's sort of new on the horizon. Let's talk about a species that's been present in Indiana for about 100 years. This is the purple loosestrife, which is a very pretty plant. Don't get me wrong, but this is a species that, while we are at the far end of the invasion curve, that is, they're widespread and abundant, this is actually one where we do have, I would say, a relatively successful and efficient tool for controlling them. And that's not often the case with invasive species, that we find a sort of, I don't want to say silver bullet because it's still not perfect, but it's a lot more effective, and there's less collateral damage with its management. So let's dive into the purple loosestrife. So as mentioned, these are a very pretty flower. They've got these sort of closely attached flowers on their stems that form this tall spike. They oftentimes flower pretty fully throughout the summer. Like, you'll have blooms present from June to August. They're super prominent around wetlands. Um, and similar to the Phragmites that we talked about earlier, the challenge here is that they are just really good at taking over the vegetation of a wetland to the point of crowding out anything else. And so when you have just purple loosestrife, you don't have a lot of variation in the habitat that supports a diverse community of organisms. And I mentioned that management here is actually a success story. And that is because we found, and we being the royal we, uh, in general, like, managers found a tool in these host-specific leaf-eating beetles. So it's a couple of beetles that they found from the purple loosestrife's native habitat in Europe that only eat purple loosestrife. And so after a couple of decades of experimentation, states, including Indiana, began using these leaves, or, basically raising these beetles and releasing them in areas with purple loosestrife in the 1990s. And honestly, it worked. So with the caveat there that the beetles did work, but it took many years to see. We're honestly, right now is when we're starting to actually see it. The purple loosestrife is not considered a major, I would say, a major concern of managers these days, because it has been knocked back a lot. It's still present and likely will always be present, because it just became so established, but it's not as widespread or not as abundant as it was 30 years ago. And so while this is like good news, I think there's a couple of like caution points there. And that is, the idea of biocontrol is somewhat controversial. You don't want to necessarily bring in a new species that is going to cause even more harm. And that has happened sometimes when people are like, oh, well, if I bring in a predator from the native range, it'll help. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. And the other kind of caution point is, it's not a quick fix. So, these beetles were first released in the 1990s, and it's only been in, like, 20, 30 years later that we're able to see and document sort of significant declines in the purple loosestrife abundance. So I think in that case, it's kind of, thinking about the invasion curve. Yes, it is something that we have a tool for sort of late stage management, but it probably would have been, in general, a lot cheaper and a lot more feasible if this was something that was caught early on. However, it was introduced back in like the late 1800s, early 1900s as an ornamental species. So we probably were a little bit more limited in what we could do. Hindsight's 2020 with this one, but thinking about other species, if it's a species that we can, prevent being sold as an ornamental in the future that could potentially become invasive, we wouldn't have to go through this entire process of, 130 years later, finally getting a handle on things. And so the last species I'd like to talk about today is to leave you on somewhat of a hopeful note because invasive species can be kind of a bummer sometimes. When we think about it, it's like, we want our healthy ecosystems, and that can be really challenging when you have something that is changing the ecosystem and there are limited tools to deal with it. Hydrilla is another aquatic plant. Unlike Phragmites and the purple loosestrife, this is one that you'll find more in the water. So it's a submerged slash floating aquatic plant. And this is something that we are, in Indiana at least, are still very much in the prevent stage. I will say that there was one uh, instance of hydrilla being found in Indiana, I believe in like 2006, kind of north central in Lake Manitou. And the DNR went at it. Like it was a very aggressive, very expensive treatment that they did for at least a couple of years and then several years of monitoring afterwards. Um, that resulted in it being eradicated from that lake. And since then, knock on wood, we have not had another hydrilla outbreak in Indiana. But Illinois, unfortunately, has. And that's where I'll talk a little bit about a case study that happened in Illinois that we can learn from, and actually is a happy story, but a successful story. So first off, what does hydrilla look like? If you're like me, who is not a plant person, it looks like all the other floating green plants in a pond. However, it does have some defining characteristics, and some of those are that the leaves typically are found in these whorls of anywhere from 3 to 10. I think it's typically closer to like 5. The leaves are also really sharply toothed or serrated, and that's very distinct. They also typically form these little sort of nodules or what we call tubers. You may not always see them, but if you do see them, it's like pretty obvious that it's hydrilla because some of the other plants that it looks like that we have in our region don't form the tubers. And what some of those other plants are, they also look very similar to another invasive species called Brazilian alodia. Um, Difference there is that the leaves don't have as much of a visibly toothed or serrated edge. Um, and then hydrilla also looks similar to our native American alodia. Um, and again, similar, like the leaves aren't as serrated, and the whorls for Alodia are exactly 3 leaves, where it's typically more than that in Hydrilla. Again, aquatic plants can be somewhat difficult to uh, ID. So if you have any, questions or this is weird, we'll actually talk a little bit about reporting to end, but I would say reach out to your local extension specialist and they can connect you with someone who can help confirm the ID. And so I mentioned, Indiana had the one outbreak in 2006 that was taken care of. Illinois, we've had a more recent hydrilla scare, and this was in DuPage County, which is one of the kind of collar counties around the Chicago area. In October of 2024, this essentially homeowners association reached out to the Illinois Department of Natural Resources and said, hey, we're seeing a really weird plant that we have not seen before in our sort of homeowners association lake, this Ginger Creek Lake. And when the DNR went to go scope it out, they're like, oh, this isn't just a little bit of hydrilla, it's a lot of hydrilla in the lake. And so they found the plant actually rooted in the lake and sort of this stream that leads to the Des Plaines River, which is one of the tributaries that connects like the Lake Michigan to the Illinois River. And then they found fragments a little bit further downstream. And so the big concern is we don't want this to get into either Lake Michigan or the Illinois River. So we need to come up with a plan to address this. So what happened? The DNR started applying herbicide monthly. So report came in end of the growing season, so October of 2024, right at the beginning of the growing season, in 2025, they started hitting it pretty hard with herbicide monthly and did that through September. They treated all 70 acres of the system, including the downstream area where they had not actually detected any hydrilla. This was I was not involved personally, but I know it was a huge effort. And excuse me, it's all in a residential area, so there was a lot of communication was needed with the homeowners because it was all private land. However, I end on a good note because post-treatment monitoring that happened in the fall of last year and they've been doing some treatment or some monitoring this spring into summer. So far, they have not observed any hydrilla. The asterisk is there because I know they're going to keep doing, monitoring for a couple of years to see, again, with those tubers that the hydrilla has, that can sometimes make it challenging. She may not see it, but those tubers could be present in the sediment. But it seems right now like the treatment has been successful so far. And so just to end, I think again, invasive species can be a little bit overwhelming, and it's like, what can I actually do as an individual, as a homeowner, as a landowner, as a boater? And so that, when we're thinking about aquatic invasive species, there are a lot of things that people can do to help. If you do enjoy a day out on the pond or lake, just making sure that anytime you move your boat or fishing gear between water bodies, that you're cleaning, draining any water, um, and letting it dry, honestly. That's usually the best case. If you can let it dry for 5 days, that you're not going to have the survival of those, zebra mussel veligers. Cleaning, just making sure you're taking any aquatic weeds off your boat, stuff like that. If you like to garden or landscape, uh, choosing native species instead of, non-native species that, minimizes the risk of them escaping. If you are a pet owner or you like to go fishing, just making sure that you're not releasing either your pets or your bait into water bodies. You can see there that is a huge goldfish, which we have a lot of, unfortunately, across the Great Lakes. And it's people with good intentions. I don't want my fish to, I don't want to euthanize my fish, but unfortunately, that's not exactly humane releasing them either. If they don't die, they unfortunately can become a big problem. And then finally, if you're outside, regularly and you notice something that is unusual, reporting it I mean, that's how we were able to catch the hydrilla early on, is we had people from the Homeowners Association in DuPage um, be the ones to be like, hey, something seems off here. And so if you are going to report, you can either reach out directly to the IDNR with the email address here, and you can just Google like aquatic invasive species Indiana DNR. They also check this tool called EdMaps, which is really a nice tool if you ever want to look at maps of like where are invasive species in um, my region. But a couple of things just to remember, like when you are submitting either to the DNR or to EdMaps, just making sure you can give as precise a location as possible, ideally GPS coordinates, but if you can do like a nearest address or position relative to a local landmark, that can help. If you know both the common and the scientific name, also that would be great. Date you observed it, your name and contact info if the DNR needs to follow up about anything. And then what's really, really important are photos. And I say that that's important because um, as someone who has sometimes gotten photos from people, it can be very frustrating just because I want to help, but sometimes it's like so difficult to tell what exactly I'm looking at. And so if you can, and I know it is challenging sometimes, but like trying to get multiple angles of the organism, um, to whatever extent you can get it as not blurry as possible. That can be tough when you have things that are moving like crayfish. And then if you can include the entire organism with some kind of reference of size, doesn't have to be a ruler, could be like a quarter that you have in your pocket or a pen. That can just help give an idea of the scale. And, even just talking about invasive species, there's events that go on. We do something called the Rusty Rodeo in Aurora, Illinois every year, which gets people out, with rusty crayfish, which is an invasive species in northern Illinois. But, just getting people aware of what is around them and trying to encourage some of those actions that people can take. And so I'll just leave you with a couple takeaways. We learned that invasive species, and particularly aquatic invasive species, can have some pretty significant harmful environmental and economic impacts. Even if there are treatment options available, eradication, once you get too far in the invasion process, isn't often possible, and management can be pretty costly over time. So it's better to really be vigilant about preventing the introduction and the spread of new species by, taking those preventative actions and then detecting them early on. And so I'll just leave you with a couple of resources. I'm happy to take any questions. I'm also, I've got my email address up there if you think of a question after the fact. But just thank you again for your time, and thank you, Emily, for the invitation to talk today.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, it's very unfortunate that we have to have something go wrong in order to learn about invasive species. When I think I first heard about invasive species when I was learning about bats in caves and how we were, tracing things around that shouldn't be moved around from caves to cave. So
Right.
it's unfortunate, but helpful to have more education around these things so that we can prevent it from happening more. So thanks
For
so much
sure.
for presenting. I haven't seen any um, questions in the chat, but we'll hang around here for a little bit if anyone has any questions. But our next session is September 11th on herbicides. Whether you'd like to use them or not, we'll be talking about that. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks,
Um,
everyone.